Hello, friends, and welcome to the Interworld podcast, where we explore the intersection of personal and collective transformation. My name is Yasha S. Wagner, and I'm a PhD researcher in the field of psychology, well-being, and spirituality, as well as the founder of the Interworld Institute for Inner World Peace. You can learn more about our nonprofit by going to interworld.org. Today, I have the great honor and privilege of being joined by a teacher of mine, a friend, a collaborator named Ramon Gabrieloff-Parish. Ramon is an associate professor of interdisciplinary studies at Naropa University. I happen to know the inside scoop. He's one of the most celebrated and legendary professors on campus. Ramon is also an incredible change maker and really a teacher of many different disciplines and topics. So I'm very excited to have Ramon here with us today. Ramon is also a presenter at our upcoming event on the spring equinox, where he'll actually be giving a two-part, 2-hour workshop, including practices and a lecture about astrology and speaking on our panel. So we're very happy to have Ramon with us both today and very soon at the Equinox event. So without further ado, here's our interview with Ramon. Ramon, hello, welcome.
All right. Hello. What's up, Yasha? What's up, everybody?
Yeah, good to see you. Thanks for coming on.
Definitely.
So I'm sure the bio there didn't quite do it justice, and would love for the people to hear a little bit more of an introduction to your backstory, your work, and anything you can do to give us a fuller picture.
Yeah, what do I say? I am a lifelong resident of Colorado, or the indigenous lands of the Arapaho and the Ute and the Cheyenne and the Apache, and some people say 40 other peoples. Grew up here on the Front Range, in the plains, little in the mountains. Raised my children here, met my wife here, and I feel pretty rooted here as a landless individual, but feel pretty rooted in Colorado and this ecosystem, this geography, even the Southwest, even New Mexico, Arizona, Utah to an extent. And I am currently a professor at Naropa University. I work at the undergraduate level. Interdisciplinary, what does that mean? I mean, I think almost everybody's interdisciplinary these days. You're really trying to relate different ways of seeing the world, different ways of developing knowledge, different fields of professional practice. And for me, some of that looks like the overlap between sustainability and regeneration and social justice. So courses like food and environmental justice. And there's also a whole kind of strain of my work that's about embodiment and rites of passage and movement. And then also, sort of imaginative and creative practices and disciplines like, recently been really doing a lot of work around Afrofuturism, Black futurisms, looking at them both as like, historical, artistic, academic movements, and as creative practices. And I'll say more about that, or maybe even a kind of wisdom tradition. I can say more about that later. I'm trying to be involved. I'm just a human being who's trying to be involved. And really, just to be real, that I kind of have a pull between a part of me that's like contemplative and wants to be a hermit and kind of sit back in some somewhat isolated space and look out at the world and live in my thoughts and my dreams and in my visions, and a person who almost because of that feels compelled to be out there connecting, building, inspiring, linking, wondering, here and there, agitating, yeah. So I'll start there.
Beautiful. Thank you. I just want to mention something I skipped in my introduction that I think is really important. You mentioned briefly there. So you're a husband and a father. And how many kids do you have?
I have 3 children.
Wow.
And my wife, Michelle, and I have 3 children. And in a way, it's like, if I know anything, it's because I had just enough gas, just enough wherewithal to stick through and raise my children, who at this point, the oldest is a young adult and the youngest is about to graduate high school. So just the journey of like seeing a human being go from seed to sprout to tree is, I should even say, from idea, from a
Mm-hmm.
longing or an intuition to a seed to a sprout to a tree, is really, really amazing. And the changes that you have to go through as a person to meet your children, because they're not really your children, right? Like, like the saying goes, they're life's children, and they are living for purposes that are bigger than what you want for them or what you expect or what you know about them. And so just the changes of having that you go through, just like being with children, being in a long-term relationship, the compromises you have to make, the little deaths, the little resurrections. I feel like that really gives me the ground in a way to do any kind of educating, to do any kind of creative work, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on all 3 kids successfully growing up with, I'm sure, an amazing father. I can certainly say, thank you for doing what you do and being who you are there. Because I happen to know intimately, the different effects of how present or not present a father is in one's life. And I think that it's a huge, important, thing to emphasize and appreciate. So I appreciate you naming all of that. And I think it's beautiful. And also, it's a great example even of what you were talking about with the like call to a more monastic contemplative existence, and then even just on the level of our immediate relationships around us, there's already this opportunity for like a practice and a growth to happen in ourselves, like you were talking about long-term relationship, the commitment levels, all of this. It's a powerful topic. So yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I would love to get into some more of your work. You were talking about being an interdisciplinary scholar and teacher, which is a very interesting topic to me in general. And I think we can circle back to a bit. I have some research that you might find interesting to share on that topic. But it's also related, that research, to the discipline of astrology in particular, which I know that you are also a student and a teacher of the discipline of astrology, and have given some amazing lectures at our events in the past and soon to be again. So I'm curious if you'd like to share kind of how your journey brought you to study that particular approach, anything that you can give us as like background and context for listeners who may already be familiar and interested, or skeptical or not know much about it, just like to really give a picture of what is it, what does it mean, what is it based in, and how do you relate to it, astrology
Hmm.
itself.
Yeah. I appreciate the fullness of that question. So I feel like for me, my journey with astrology really it actually starts with Colorado and the Colorado skies, and being a kid. and, being out on the prairie. I used to live in a part of town. I used to live in Aurora, and I lived in a part of town where if you looked west, there was development. And if you looked east, it was just black. It was just horizon. And at night, it was just stars. And so I felt like early on in life, I had this fascination with the sky. I had a fascination with weather, with rain, with snow, with the rainbows and the thunderstorms and the summers, with the changing of the seasons, and with the night sky, looking at the moon, looking at the Orion constellation. I had telescopes. I used to like draw little pictures of the solar system. Like I was in first grade and I like won this contest, or I got second place in this contest to like in the school for a drawing. And I drew the solar system. And so I was just into the sky as a little kid. And, some of your audience might relate to this. I don't know if it's a reality or not, but that kind of the feeling that people name as being a starseed. Okay. Like, I don't know if it's a reality, but that feeling spoke to me. Early on, I had a feeling that like I wasn't really from the planet Earth, you know? And I think that's actually a primordial intuition that a lot of people around the world have had, which is that part of our soul. If you believe in that kind of thing, part of our soul actually comes from beyond the earth. Like when I was a child, I would look up at the stars and I had a feeling of like, had a feeling of looking at home, and which also gave me the feeling that I was a embodied being and I definitely by the time I was 10, this was a conscious feeling, who was here essentially like on stage, and I was being viewed by the stars kind of. And so, then, adolescence happens, and, that feeling kind of goes underground in different ways. And then I would say in my late teens and early 20s, my early college years, I started to get into this thing where I would watch first the sunset, and then I would watch the moon. And then I started to pay attention to the cycles of the moon. And I'd go out every night and just hang out with it for a little bit. And then I started to notice all kinds of things. And at this point in my life, I'd already started asking a lot of really fundamental questions. Does God exist? What am I supposed to do with my life? What makes life meaningful? Who am I? All of those kinds of things. And so, yeah, I started to watch the moon and also watch the patterns in my life, or what felt like patterns. And I felt I would find myself in these sort of repetitious situations. I would be in the same situation, even if it was different people, same situation, multiple times. And until I made a choice to do something different, that situation would just reconfigure itself over and over. And it was a feeling of deja vu a little bit. It was an odd feeling, but eventually what I started to wonder was, wait, does this have something to do with the moon? Is there some kind of like cycle of how you feel and what you experience? And or if we watch the moon and then train ourselves with it, do we start to live in a rhythm with it? And also at this time, I had a practice of writing. I was writing poetry. And maybe I'll say more about it, but I'm just on the spring equinox also releasing a small book of poetry that actually comes out of this time period. And yeah, so I had a practice of writing. And then in my writings, I started to find that like the planets would appear essentially as characters or as like worlds that I could just kind of journey into a little bit in the writing. And so I feel like what happened first was I developed an intuition and an experiential feeling and relationship to astrology before I knew anything about it as a practice and as an art, as a lore, depending on your point of view, as a science. And so, I had really basic stuff, chart readings and that kind of stuff. Like I had my chart that I was starting to look at, but really what happened is I started to do dance and movement practices, and this will we can speak a bit more about this later, at this place called the Star House in Boulder. And the Star House was designed by this gentleman, David Tressimer, who passed a few years ago. And it has these 12 pillars in the building. And it's basically a round building, 12 pillars. And each one of the pillars is a sign of the zodiac. It's got a plate with a sign of the zodiac there. And I was dancing in this space for years and years and years. And honestly, I felt like the archetype of the zodiac got imprinted on me by dancing in those spaces. And it was already a living imagination inside of me just based off of those earlier years, but dancing in it. And I started to get like a sense and started to develop an internal and imaginative relationship with each one of the constellation or each one of the signs. And then I started to converse with people around me. Oh, what's your sun sign? What's your moon sign? Blah, blah, blah. And notice little patterns, little overlaps. And so by the time around 2009, I got into the study of astrology in an earnest way. I built it into my graduate studies at Prescott College and started to study it from a historical perspective, started to study it from a philosophical perspective, from a psychological perspective. And I started to develop my own practice, which was mostly around like building creative ceremonial experiences using astrology. And then around 2011, I was always really interested. And I felt like even in the early days, I felt I had a stronger relationship with the outer planets than I did with the inner planets. And in my own birth chart, the outer planets are all very prominent. And so I started to track the longer cycles of the outer planets. And I was looking at the cycle of the planet Uranus. And Uranus went into Aries in 2011. It went into stay in 2011. And I'm forgetting the exact day right now. Uranus is a planet, astrologically, is associated with shock, with rapid change, with surprise, with like the breakthrough of kind of visionary experiences, with reversals, with mass like communication and mass like sort of like revolutionary and rebellious impulses. Uranus was discovered, or its discovery was verified around the time of the American and French revolutions. And so the way that astrologers kind of developed the meaning structures for the outer planets is based off of what was happening around the time that they were verified, and also their kind of observed effects in the centuries and decades since. And so I started watching Uranus, and on the day that it went direct into Aries, okay, and in astrology, the whole cycle, the whole zodiac cycle begins with Aries. And there's something in the 0 degrees Aries called the Aries point, and it's thought to be like an explosive energy. It's like the energy of wood in the Chinese medicinal tradition. It's something that just, bah. Okay. And that night that Uranus went into Aries, Fukushima happened. And Uranus and all the outer planets to a lesser degree, but Uranus and Pluto especially are both associated with earthquakes. And then Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, but especially Uranus and Pluto, are associated with radioactivity, uranium, plutonium. There's even a Neptunium. And so the day it goes into Aries, there's this earthquake underneath the ocean, slaps a tsunami of water into Japan, into Fukushima, smashes up their nuclear power plant. And I was like, wow. Like I was like, are you serious? And you can verify this yourself. You can go, there's an astrological tool. It's really an astronomical tool as well called an ephemeris. And nowadays with computers, we have ephemerises that can go forward or backward 5,000 years. But ephemeris basically tells you the degree placement of all the planets as they make their way around the sun and through all the 12 signs of the zodiac. And you can go verify this. The day that Fukushima happened is the day that Uranus went into Aries. And I had it on my calendar for months before. And so that really piqued my interest and really got me looking strongly at the outer planets. And at that time, I was studying an astrologer named Jessica Murray, who does a lot of kind of like political based astrology. And and see, this is another thing that people often don't know is our starting point for astrology is our sun sign. And that's a good starting point. Well, first of all, as an individual, you have all of your planets, all of the planets were in a certain position when you were born. And all of them have information from the astrological lens about your, psychological development, about like your destiny potentials. And so there's a personal psychological level of astrology, but there's also a part of astrology called mundane astrology or historical or civilizational astrology. And before astrology was used to look at the psychic composition of an individual, it was used on a collective level by rulers, by statespeople, you know, by farmers. And so the outer planets, because they have a longer orbit, Uranus has an orbit around the sun of 87 years. Neptune has an orbit of 146 approximately, Pluto of 250. And because they have a longer orbit and they stay in signs for a longer period of time, they're thought to reveal more of our collective dynamics than our individual dynamics. And so also, as a university student, I was a student of philosophy and history, and I was interested in the large scale patterns. I was interested in sociological patterns and historical patterns, if there can be said to be them. Mm-hmm. And so I start looking at these outer planets, and it's not just a single orbit, it's the relationship between two or more planets that's also significant. So I started tracking this relationship and hearing from this astrologer, Jessica Murray, about she thought there was going to be a lot of significance in the relationship between Pluto and Uranus in the mid 2010s, because those two planets would form a square. Okay. And a square in astrology is a formation of tension and of blocked energy, and it requires willpower to work through. And it helps us build willpower if we have a square in our individual chart. But we can also experience it as the energy of being thwarted. And so that particular relationship, and I'm excited about this stuff, so you can stop me when you need to.
No, I want to hear all of it. I have several comments and other topics, but I want to make sure you get through the full scope.
Okay, I'll touch on this and one other thing. That particular relationship between Pluto and Uranus. Okay, Pluto and Uranus between 1965 and 68 made what's called a conjunction. That means the two planets, from our point of view on Earth, appear to be lined up in front of one another. And a conjunction is a beginning of a cycle. It's a point when two energies begin a new relationship and close an old one. Now, astrologers, even before this was happening in the 60s and 50s, were saying when Pluto and Uranus come together, we're going to experience a big quake socially, and we're going to experience the breakthrough of a lot of new energy. Of course, we know what happened. In my point of view, and the point of view of a lot of people, I mean, this entire podcast, Naropa University, the entire wave of culture that we are riding on was basically crystallized at that point between 65, 64, 65, 67, 69. So when two planets then move past the point where they're most aligned into a square, and a square is basically a right angle relationship, that is the first step in it can be considered the first major step in that cycle. If we want to break a cycle down into 4 parts, and you could break a cycle down into 4 parts like you can a season. A cycle's got a winter, it's got a spring, it's got a summer, it's got a fall. So the winter part of that cycle ended basically in roughly 2015. And now we're entering into the spring part of that cycle. And so that ended with a square. And that was a square. Pluto was in Capricorn. Uranus was in Aries. And astrologers said, no, there's going to be a confrontation between the forces in our society that are really upholding the status quo and the forces in our society that are represented and I think crystallized again in that 65, 64 through 69 period that are representing this new formation of energy that's really trying to establish itself culturally and on Earth. There's going to be a clash there. And what do we see happen in 2015's the teens? Black Lives Matter. Let me see if I can mute that. Okay, so what do we see happen in the 2015s? Black Lives Matter, wave one. Occupy. Okay, the Arab Spring. Even the Tea Party. Okay, the Israeli rent strikes. People said that what we were going to experience was a lot of spontaneous revolutionary activity. Spontaneous is both Uranus and Aries energies. And I was reading the stuff before it happened, and then I watched it play out. And at that point, I was like, yo, something is really going on here. And I think there is a way. I don't think it's exact. There's a lot of discrepancy. There's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of folkloric accumulation, which also is a storage of its own knowledge in a way. But there's a lot of accumulation around astrology. But when I saw that, I was like, yo, something is going on. And astrology is a map. It is an ancestral technology that helps us map some type of relationship in the psychic flux and structure of our world, both individually and collectively. So now I'm really all about tracking these outer planetary cycles. And I think that because astrology is a science that's discredited in the mainstream, empirically science-based world, and it is hard to demonstrate on that. But because it's discredited, people don't use it. But, Ronald Reagan and his wife used it. It is used by rulers. It is used by stockbrokers. And I think as people who are involved in different types of social movements, spiritual movements, artistic movements, sustainability movements, I think we got to be paying attention to this stuff and using it and anticipating it. So I'm going to stop there because I could go on.
Yeah.
If you got questions. Yeah.
No, it's so rich. I realized as we got into this one topic that we might have to do more than one episode with you in the coming months and years. But yeah, I love it. I mean, I don't want to water it down at all. I want to get the whole scope. I think it's really important, and I couldn't agree more with pretty much just everything you're saying. I think it's very valuable and reflects a lot of my own experience. I'm less learned in astrology in particular, but have the same perspective on it and am studying for those reasons. And I want to kind of come full circle and make a few different comments, starting with some of the last things you said about like the science and it being an ancient technology, maybe difficult to demonstrate through modern science to skeptics. But some of the things that I find very interesting is people claim that maybe it's hard to prove or shown not to be a certain way. I think the opposite is true. I think that when modern scientific research demonstrates for a fact that our entire sense of well-being is inextricably and intimately linked to our relationship to the sun and how much sunlight we're getting and where in the sky the sun is and whether or not we're looking at it and for how long and what part of the year it is and all of that, it's proven. We know that sunlight itself, the actual energy coming into our bodies and eyes from the sun, have a direct effect on us as people, probably as societies. We know, through modern scientific, double checking and affirming, like, oh yes, like well, first of all, we're made of water. We know that now. We know that all the bodies of water are directly under the rule of the energy and the gravitational pull of the moon and the moon's phases. We know this. And I think something I've heard, one of my main teachers who you heard briefly speak online at the Sustainable Living Conference, who's my indigenous Taino elder, Maestro Manuel, but speaks about how the same stuff you were talking about at the very beginning regarding the sense of soul and self and coming from the stars, being star seeds, that appears in ancient traditions around the world, in ancient perspectives from various First Nations on being a people who come from the stars, right? And it's like, now science has proven and confirmed, like, yes, we are made of star stuff. We are made out of the stardust. That is where we came from. Our entire body's built out of the star materials, right? So all of that's just to say, whether we look at the sun, the moon, or the stars, all of these claims astrology has made since time immemorial in different cultures. Modern science is saying, oh, no, it's true. We are made of the stars. That is where we come from. The sun and moon have a direct impact on our planet and on our well-being and psyche, all of that. So I just wanted to name that. I also want to say that, I don't talk about this all that often. I find it to be perhaps like the truest, most intimate sort of part of my sense of story as well, but I just deeply relate to those starseed kind of comments you were making. I don't talk about this that often, but I was born with a sense of prenatal memory. So literally and there's like my friend who I met when I was 2 years old, he lives in the house next door at our community center, and we've been working on this organization since our earliest memories as toddlers. So my sense of soul, like literally our mission, our organization, all of that started in childhood. It wasn't directly coming from parents. It was supported, but it was not, promoted in any way by them. And it's from literally my earliest memories, the sense of mission, the sense of what humanity is going through right now, why I'm here, where I came from, all of that. And I could go into so much more detail there, and I won't today, but just wanted to share that and share how much I relate to that. And lastly, I had some comments before I get into some more questions, just to share with you my own research I'm doing, because there's a lot of overlap there. Some of my work with my dissertation and stuff. So for starters, there's all this debate about what is our story as a species? When did people come to the Americas? When were the pyramids built? All these things, right, that people are debating right now. But something I find really beautiful is that the scientific research agrees way, way before any of that. All of this, the storytelling, the fire keeping, the ceremony, all of that started. That was millions of years ago, not 10,000. Oh, we're debating, is it 5,000? Is it 10,000? We know for a fact humans and other hominids were gathering around fires. And we see evidence that there were likely ceremonial activities and storytelling of some sort since 2 million years ago. Yeah. And I believe that is also the starting point of when we were able to more safely come out at night, communicate with each other, look up at the sky at night, observe the movement of the stars, because there's a fire to warm and illuminate and protect us during the nighttime. Otherwise, like you shared in your astrology workshop for our Naropa Heartfire event a couple years back, otherwise we're just waiting on the sun to save us from the cold and dark in the morning. But once you have fire, which is 2 million years ago, we're able to gather and tell stories and study the stars. And this last piece of my research, I think you'll love, and maybe you already know this, you could look it up, but there's some incredible findings that I just think are so exciting about the Pleiades related mythologies around the world. So we've known for a long time that there's these like eerie, uncanny similarities and parallels, whether it's all the way into Australia and the Aboriginal traditions, all the way to Hawaii, Lakota, African, Greek, all over the world. And they're telling unbelievably, weirdly, like ominously similar stories about the Pleiades that almost always talk about a seventh character, sister, young woman being abducted and disappearing all over the world, right? And so much more recently, these astronomical star mapping technologies were used by newer researchers, peer-reviewed studies. You can look it up. It's amazing. They turned the clock back 100,000 years. That's how far they had to go. Yeah. And it's 100,000 years ago, it was visible to the naked eye that there is indeed a seventh star in the Pleiades system. And right around 100,000 years ago, it came close enough to the sixth star that it became invisible to the naked eye. Yeah. So, and what they're saying is, so you know what? they used to try to write it off because they couldn't explain it with our dominant Western theory of history. And they were like, yeah, no, we, the Europeans, we got there and they took our story. It's like, that's the dumbest thing ever. Like now these interdisciplinary researchers are saying, no, you know what? Let's actually listen to the stories the indigenous elders are telling us that have been there for thousands of years and take that seriously. And the reason this comes all the way back to why I said I want to mention interdisciplinary when you started sharing it. The reason I think this is especially interesting for academia is we have to get interdisciplinary to get insights and realizations like this one, where we're combining anthropology and saying, no, let's actually listen to the indigenous elders instead of pretending that we gave them the story. And let's also use technology and map where the sky was 100,000 years ago. And the conclusion they're coming to is, you know what, there is an explanation. It's just a theory. We don't know if it's true. But it's likely that around 100,000 years ago, there was a big diaspora of our species traveling all over the world from Africa at different waves and phases over time. But that this story might actually be a shared heritage, that it might be among all these different tribes because it actually originated with our shared origins as a species sitting around these fires, who knows how long ago, observing the Pleiades star system change in front of our eyes generation to generation. And I just think that's amazing. And I think it's amazing that interdisciplinary collaboration between everything from ancient traditions to modern technology can get us to these conclusions and realizations. So just wanted to share that.
Totally. I feel like this is so one of the beauties of our times is that we can bring our different cosmologies into conversation with each other. We can bring our different ways of learning and gathering information and organizing data in a relationship with one another. And like, I think that's also the thing too about like, we can relax on which one is right a little. We have a problem now because we have a problem now of like discerning what's reality and what's false. And that's going to continue to get more intense, I think, as the digital technologies continue to evolve. Like it's going to get more intense. So we do have to have some criteria, but we can also relax a little bit and like be curious and like, I think we have to be, we're struggling over in this society whether we should be bi or multilingual. I think we've got to be multi-ontological. We've got to be able to hold simultaneous different world views in our minds. And then, like Paul Miller, DJ Spooky, he had this whole thing of like, you got to play them like records. You got to have one ontology going like this and then fade the other one in and then try to make some kind of new music out of two or more ontologies at the same time. And it seems like sometimes when you cross disciplines, you cross ontologies, they can actually overlap and confirm and complement one another. So
no, I love it. And I don't want to take us off topic, but just as a quick side note, I even think all the things that you're giving as sort of metaphors to illustrate on some level are the same thing. So I'm speaking as a multilingual person, grew up speaking Russian and English, first marriage and living abroad, learned Spanish, speak 3 languages. I see linguistic systems as kind of like reality maps or filters. So even just speaking multiple languages, we're already, as a result, needing to include multiple ontologies.
Totally.
And that's a whole nother topic. I think music applies to it too. Origins of DJing. You could even get into origins of hip hop, merging all the previous genres through the scratching and through the mixing, right? So it's a whole nother rabbit hole we could get into. I would love to ask you a few follow-up questions from your first kind of deep dive there and start to get into some of our other topics. But before we do, just like the main follow-ups, I wanted to hear, so you're talking about massive collective change, which is one of the primary 2 topics of our podcast, collective and individual transformation.
Hmm.
And you're talking about that in terms of we need to well, you're not saying we need to, you're not telling us what to do or what's right, but you are sharing your experience that I definitely agree with and think many listeners would, that we need to pay attention to how do these massive collective changes we're going through relate to the archetypal forces at play that are influencing them. How can we strategically align ourselves and keep that in consideration and so on, with these energies that are otherwise unconsciously influencing us,
Mm.
and so on. So um, the reason I'm recapping all of that is because I just want to ask you to give us, with the limited time we have, your kind of 2025 highlight reel, and where are we at in this human journey that you outlined already, starting from the 60s and way before the 60s and the French Revolution. You're giving us this full map, and like, where are we? How can you help orient us in the blueprint of the wave we've been riding as a society, and where is our civilization going in terms of where we're at right now with this equinox, with these radical transitions that we're currently facing?
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. Well said too. Um, yeah. So I'm going to kind of speak about the 2020s from like 2020 to 2026, roughly. Okay. First of all, resource wise, if you're interested and you haven't already, pick up Rick Tarnas's Cosmos and Psyche. He really lays it out. He lays out a pretty thorough case for astrology on individual and collective levels. Okay. Lays out a lot of this stuff and the observation of outer planetary cycles. Okay. So in 2020, y'all, we had the conjunction of Saturn and Pluto. And that only happens about every 30 to 34 years. Okay. That conjunction happened in January of 2020. Okay. Pluto is associated partly with large scale calamities and the spiritual resources we have to draw upon in order to overcome those. And Saturn is associated with this restriction, with things being blocked, things stopping, boundaries, depression. So the conjunction of those two energies, when they line up, that means those two energy forces are interacting and potentially amplifying each other, and that they're starting over in their cycle of relationship. When Rick Tarnas looked at previous conjunctions of these planets, he went back to the 13th century in Europe, and he found that one of them happened when the Black Plague happened. So January 2020, that conjunction happens. What do we know happened at that time? What became public at that time? COVID-19 became public. Okay. And then a few months later, it was a few months later in the springtime, the lockdown order swept across the planet. Okay. Whatever your view is about it, that's what we experienced. Okay. Also in 2020, we had a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. And that's also a conjunction that happens every 20 years. Now, historically, astrologers have used Saturn and Jupiter to make predictions about the changing tides of the political world, specifically rulers. And rulers, I think in China in particular, were advised to be on your best behavior when these two planets conjunct, because the people will be in a mood to overthrow you. Those two planets conjuncted December 21st on the solstice, winter solstice 2020. What happened about a week and a half later? January 6th dropped. Okay. I'm not trying to be totally American centric about this. My historical data is limited. I'm trying to expand and be more international as well. But boom. Okay. Again, regardless of what your view is on January 6th, we experienced it, and we experienced it as a challenge to the leadership of this society, the United States anyway. Okay. We also had a conjunction of Pluto and Jupiter in the spring of 2020. Okay. Jupiter is the planet of popularity. Jupiter is the planet of conventional wisdom. Jupiter is the guru planet. Okay. Jupiter is the planet of the group, of being accepted. And Pluto is this planet of the like deep churning structural forces that, if humans are not conscious, express themselves as tyranny, express themselves as violence, express themselves as crime. So Pluto and Jupiter came into conjunction in the spring of 2020. What happened a few weeks later? George Floyd got murdered publicly, and people lost it. And so in the year 2020, there were three major conjunctions that were all observable. And astrologers were saying, yo, the 2020 in particular and the 2020s in general are going to be intense. And what do we experience? I think it's safe to say that the world basically changed just a little bit. And we're still trying to reorganize ourselves as a result of that. So that was 2020. Then in 2022, you had the conjunction of Neptune and Jupiter in 2022, April. Okay. Now, there's no major event that I connect to that, in part because both Neptune and Jupiter are soft energies. They're soft, expansive energies. But the Neptune energy is really strong now. Neptune has been in Pisces since 2011, and that's its home sign. And both of those energies are water energies. They're emotional energies. They're healing energies. They're imaginative energies. They're delusional energies. They're addiction energies. Okay. And they are energies where our sense of self spreads out. And in the good way, in the helpful way, that can mean our sense of compassion expands. In the problematic way, we can't tell ourselves from other people, and we get caught up in things that we don't need to be a part of. We gaslight each other. Okay. And Neptune is now in the very last degrees of Pisces. And in the last degrees of a sign, all energies get very intense because they got to make a little karmic breakthrough again to the next one. So I think this is part of this trouble that we're having, distinguishing between fact and fiction, between our preferred narrative and the actual narrative. And also, in a way, it's part of this mixing of ontologies that's been going on for a long time. But as it expands and more people are involved in it, it really becomes difficult to know, like, how do we distinguish reality from unreality? And on whose terms? So Neptune is going to exit Pisces and enter Aries a little bit this spring. It's going to retrograde back, and then 2026 is going to go fully. Last spring in 2024, we had a conjunction of Uranus and Jupiter. And that's associated with energies that are visionary and experimental, and a lot of scientific breakthroughs. The moon landing happened at that time, if you believe it happened. The moon landing happened at that time. And so there's a lot of technological breakthroughs that often happen at that time. And one of the things I was paying attention to was there was a sort of flurry for a moment of like, well, we think we found like the cold fusion thing through kind of breaking off subatomic particles of gold, and yeah, so I could say a lot more about each one of those. But then in 2026, what we have coming up is when Neptune leaves Pisces, as I've been describing, and enters into Aries, which is to say that it begins its entire cycle around the zodiac again, 146 years. It also will be conjuncting Saturn, which is currently now in Pisces and about to exit Pisces and join both Neptune and Saturn will be in the 0 degrees of Aries. And that conjunction only happens every 34 years. The last time it happened was the collapse of the Berlin Wall. It was a genocide in Rwanda. It was a Bosnian genocide. And so some astrologers have associated Saturn's passage through Pisces with the collapse of law and order, the collapse of legal institutions that restrain certain types of like noxious behavior by human beings. And the last time it was conjunction, the world was confronted by this question of genocide. Where's the world right now as Saturn passes through Pisces? Relation to Gaza and Israel, whatever side you stand on, the question before us is there a genocide taking place before our eyes? Okay. And so And then I just found this out, gang, and then I will stop. 2026 is when this conjunction between Neptune and Saturn is going to happen in Aries. February 28th, I believe. And the last one, Berlin Wall collapsed. I started doing some digging. In 1848, shortly after Neptune was verified as a planet, discovered, aka discovered, and when it was discovered conjuncting Saturn, as it will be in 2026. This was the time in the United States of the Mexican-American War. And at that point, the United States took all this territory from Mexico, including where I'm at currently, Colorado. This used to be Mexico. New Mexico, Arizona, California. Used to be Mexico, Texas, okay? And so the border shifted south. And then the north border, there was something called the Oregon Treaty between the US and Canada, where they were still figuring out, crystallizing the border between those two nations, these two nations. And so right now, Saturn and Neptune are already within range. Once planets get to about 10 degrees of each other, the energies are effective. They're already in range. And what's going on in the United States? We got this huge struggle over immigration, and it's immigration from the South, from Latin America. Regardless of where you stand on it, that's the question before us. And what's happening in the North? The Trump administration is trying to persuade Canada to become the 51st state in the United States. So I said in the beginning, the energies of Saturn are about restriction, they're about boundaries, they're about borders. The energies of Neptune are the dissolving of borders, the spreading out of the self to include others, or the confusion of the self with others. So when Neptune and Saturn come together, part of my historical studies and astrological studies leads me to believe, and this is the technique that astrologers who study on collective level use, you got to look back at moments in history when similar configurations were happening, and you're trying to see like what was going on at that time. And if you notice patterns, and you start, right? So what I'm starting to see, I think, and I got to do more studying on this, is that when those two planets come together, there's a lot about borders on a collective level and about boundaries that gets renegotiated. And so when that goes direct in 2026, these struggles that we're having around borders, I suspect that they will be amplified. And it's also, again, like the Saturn or Jupiter, Neptune energy, it's really about who do you include, who do you have compassion for, and who do you wall yourself away from? When are borders protective and helpful? And when do they contain energy? And when are they an amputation of an actual relationship? So,
yeah, no, this is great. Thank you so much. It's really powerful stuff. At risk of bringing in yet another sort of distraction, your comments are just like jogging my memory. I was kind of just sitting on the couch the other day. I mentioned I grew up speaking Russian as because my family's from Ukraine. And I was thinking about how interesting it is that the word Ukraina, which is how we would refer to Ukraine, means at the border. I think that's very, and anyways, it's a very
wow.
random thing. And I double checked myself,
Wow.
and it came to me just from my own relationship to language sitting there, but I double checked it and looked it up. I'm like, yeah, no, it's exactly what I thought. And I'm saying this even at a level that might be more intuitive to someone like me that's a native speaker than what you can find on Google. Because when you say, I'm like, oh yeah, Ukraina, like at the border, at the edge. That's like literally the name of the country. It's so interesting to me. And like at the interface, right? It's a very interesting topic. But anyways, that was a little bit of a side note about, language and,
I mean,
yeah, yeah,
that's also up right now,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And really the world order that was created post World War II and the boundaries and the strategic alliances, which I think, there's nations, borders, and then there's blocks. That's also all, it's under a Neptunian meltdown right now.
right,
It's
right.
under a giant reshuffling. So I mean, to me, that's like no accident. That's crazy. I gotta have to look into that, or
Yeah.
any information you got about that. That's
Well, these are the kinds of insights I love to just spark, because it's not even something that I know of being in any sort of debate, but it's the kind of like archetypal thing. I mean, you can just look it up and fact check me. It's a fact, but it's also fun. Like my family's very involved because there's relatives and it's a whole thing. But for me, it was just like a random insight that you reminded me of with the astrological topics. So, you know,
100%.
yeah, fertile ground there to keep exploring. I'd love to, with the time we have left, start to transition into a few of these other topics, and we might have to jump around, merge some things. But the main segue I'm interested in right now is, you mentioned creating your own ceremonial practices around astrology. And I think that's a great segue also into beginning to address the topic of initiation, rites of passage, and kind of the intersection between topics like astrology and the embodied ceremonies and rites that I've seen you conduct that are influenced by or based in astrology, and how that relates to the ancient origins of these human traditions and the kind of sacred science of initiation and rites of passage. It's obviously yet another huge topic, but I'd love to just get a download on both their connection with each other and especially on initiation and rites of passage itself.
Totally. Yeah, I'll kind of mash a bunch of things together. Okay, so going back to this period in my late teens and early 20s, which really was the formative period for my entire life, basically, so far. I felt that I had a series of initiatory experiences. Most of them were internal, but like good synchronicities, I also had these sort of magnetized external micro dramas that I had to work through. But most of them were these really intense internal experiences for which at that time I did not have any language for. And after they happened, I knew I was changed. And it was over a period of years. I felt different after that. And I felt in a way like we talk about the term, we use the term coming of age, you know? And I feel like when you come of age in a way, it's almost like you literally come into proportion with the proportions of the planet. And then you now that you are proportional with the planet, like you have to decide how you're going to navigate around the map of the planet. And so I had that feeling really strongly. And it was a match with the feeling that I had at 10 years old around looking at the stars and feeling like I came from there to do something here. And it was so strong, but I had no real outlets for it other than writing. And I was up to some things. My wife and I were up to some things. We started some of our work around sustainability and climate justice shortly after that. We had a family. We started a family. And that really, for me, was like, that was like my commitment to the earth at that point was like, oh, you're really going to stay here, you know? And you have to care about what happens here. And you have to care about yourself. You can't throw yourself away. But I still didn't really have a way to express what I had experienced. And so it's a long story, but I ended up coming into a relationship with this group called Golden Bridge, which is led by Melissa Michaels, who's a spiritual educator, somatic-based educator. And she communicated to us and put us through a version of like kind of the model of a rite of passage, and really communicated to us that historically in nations all over the world, in indigenous nations, and even societies to a certain extent as they urbanized, people created ceremonial containers, ritual containers for their young people, and even people at different phases of life to catalyze psychological transformation, to help people remember their origins as spiritual beings and their responsibility to the rest of the community from their spiritual root and their uniqueness. And they created these containers to catalyze that for young people and to make a clear distinction between the responsibility, the world of childhood and the responsibilities of adulthood, including how you work with the energies of fertility, for example. In a small community, you can't just have people have children and not take any responsibility for them. You know, they had to be, they disciplined their youth to be like, no, like you're working with cosmic energy because you can help in their generation of life. And so you have to basically act. An adult is somebody who is a conscious cooperator with the cosmic energy of life and is in conscious cooperation with their community. And so Melissa created these experiences for us, you know, using dance, using somatic psychology, using some of Rudolf Steiner's life maps, using her own studies, using her own struggles. She created these experiences and she invited people from all over the world. We had people all over the world there: Palestine, Israel, India, Brazil, South Africa, Kenya, Chicago, Boulder, California, Australia, New Zealand. We were from all over. And her intention was to try to create a sort of international or multicultural rite of passage, because her sense was that that's actually part of the initiation as a planet that we are going through. You know, post-colonization, we are all up in each other's face. People from all over are all over. I go to Walmart, people from Ethiopia, people from Serbia, just at Walmart. So, and we had a lot of learning to do as a group and as an organization. We didn't do it perfectly, and we had a lot of the kind of paradigm of we're all one in the 90s, and we had to, in the 2000s, we had to really get into the intricacies of what that means and the different historical layers of power between people, race, class, gender, you know, nationality, language, religion, spiritual traditions, appropriation. We had a lot of sorting to do, and we're still doing it. And then that led to me being part of, because Golden Bridge kind of helped create this organization called Youth Passageways. And we did a lot of work just trying to like help people develop, I'll just call it a post-colonial lens on rites of passage. You know, we can't be pre-colonization. We have to really understand that that's how in this period of history, most of us have lost access to our traditions of rites of passage traditions is through colonial process. Even Europeans denuded themselves of that through their kind of like, you know, the gaining of rational empiricism and the loss of religious or mythic consciousness. So that really became the foundation in a way for me as an educator. You know, understanding education as a relationship, understanding it as mentorship. Even if you're just there with a person at a point in their life as a little stable post to push off of. Okay. And then also helped me to really understand, oh, I'm a father and I'm going through these different phases my children are going through. I'm a husband. I got to be communicative. I got to be, you know, willing to accept feedback, you know. And then as somebody who identified as a star child and as a very much mentally oriented person, and as a person who was mentally oriented to keep himself safe, you know, I grew up in an environment with mostly white people. And, you know, you're the black kid, mostly white people, you're a target, sadly enough. And so I was very disembodied. And Melissa's focus was really on how do we bring the forces of the soul into relationship with them? How do we have our emotions have a breathing, cycling life and not be stuck and caught up and explosive? How do you line the body, the heart, the mind, get those in line, and then the soul can drop? And so many of us live regularly disaligned with those that it makes it harder for the messages of the soul to come through and to have a vehicle of expression, you know? And so then people are a little bit more purposeless or confused about their purpose. And I'm not claiming I have 100% transmission clarity, but I've had a few moments in my life where I've had some clarity, and those moments are enough to guide me for long periods of time and get some water from the well and then camel through the desert for a minute. And so part of the work of organizations like Golden Bridge and Youth Passageways is how do we help to recreate traditional rites of passage? And that can go a lot of different ways. Some people are trying to reclaim their traditional rites of passage. A lot of people of color are trying to reclaim traditional rites of passage. Some of them are partial reconstructions and fresh creations. And some of them are people are learning things. Sometimes they've appropriated things. Sometimes they've adapted things. And the Spirit can always create anew. The Spirit can always create afresh. And at the same time, it's important to recognize how we've influenced one another. Where if you learn to practice from somebody, say it. Make sure you say it. You know, I'll be honest with you. My pride sometimes prevents me from wanting to share who my teachers were, you know, and that goes on an individual level, and that goes between nations and between cultures. And if we want peace in the world, if we want a world of peace, a lot of it is going to be because we are willing to acknowledge one another and acknowledge the realities and the histories of our relationships with one another. I mean, like, you know, we got to do that. So the rite of passage model, how do we, separation, initiation, reincorporation, how do we bring that, revive that? How do we create containers for that? How do we recognize the moments? How do we recognize when young people are going through that period where they need that? You know, when we're going through changes in our adult life, you experience a divorce, you know what I mean? You have a chronic illness where the life forces transformation on you. How do we create a place where we can recognize, yo, this person's a little different now. They got a little different responsibilities now. And, you know, that all goes hand in hand with the work to try to reconstitute community, not just from the social level, not just from the spiritual level, but from the infrastructural level. You know, part of our problem is we don't even have the infrastructure so humans meet enough to form community. And as we digitize, that's getting trickier and trickier. Of course, it opens up opportunities as well.
Yeah. Thank you. It's fascinating. There's that two-sided blade there with all of these changes we're going through, whether it's, you know, the fact that we can fly around the world or look at videos on the internet. It means, you know, when there's a virus or when there's a protest or whatever it might be, you know, it's in this hemisphere, it's in that hemisphere a day later, you know, so there's risks and there's great potential as well to the kind of growing edge, the crossroads that we're at in a collective human coming of age ceremony that we're in a collective human rite of passage that we're going through, shedding old versions of what our civilization and civilizations that rise and fall may have looked like, and what we're stepping into now. So powerful stuff. I don't mean this as flattery, but when you make a podcast, it's like you're supposed to mark clips of, you know, great clips. And sometimes I'm like digging through, like, where do I find a good clip? But with your episode, the whole thing's the good clip. It's just the minefield of. So, anyways, I want to touch upon a few things you mentioned and some last topics here. I love hearing the perspectives on coming of age, what our responsibilities are. It brings up this idea of moving from dependence to independence to interdependence, and how, you know, if there's insufficient psychological maturation, we could remain dependent or codependent. But then there could also be an in-between phase where we're freeing ourselves. And maybe this all aligns to humans' civilizational rites of passage as well. But there's this like freeing ourselves and being independent, boundary drawing and relying on oneself. But then there's this interdependence where what if others could also rely on me? And what if we all rely on each other in a symbiotic, synergistic way? So it's a deep exploration. And I think it's beautiful how initiations and rites of passage, whether it's a symbolic sort of ceremony to honor that, or it's the real lived experience of growth that happens through these phases, you know, how that can help us recognize that any death, you called it little deaths at the beginning of the episode, you know, with fatherhood and so on. It's like, It's like any death is also a rebirth into something new. And then I think the greatest initiation from a spiritual perspective might be the death of the cycles of death and rebirth, where we're just identifying ourselves with the temporary identity we happen to be in, or the role we happen to be playing at a given phase, and recognize that we're dying into sort of the more eternal dimension of who we are, and being born into that. So, lots of imagery there. It's a whole, I think it shows up everywhere from ancient Egypt to the resurrection and so on. It's very, very beautiful study. But I'm curious, also just want to speak to what you said about naming our teachers, which I tried to do at the beginning of the episode, and just say with one of my teachers when I was naming an idea. And I just want to say that I've found this same idea come up, whether it's in academia and scholarship. It's like when I'm researching, I'm innovating new ideas, but I have to give credit to the fact that there's nothing new under the sun. And all of this is, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. All of this is coming from somewhere. And I think it's hilarious as a Jungian scholar. I think, no disrespect to Jung. I think he's incredible. I think he could have done more of that, actually. I think it's funny that I'm writing and I need to give credit to Jung for an idea, maybe that I'm actually getting for the I Ching, but the thing is, that's where he got it.
That's right. Right.
Yeah. And so I think it's good to honor those things. And I think that, it's the same in the wisdom traditions, whether they're more shamanistic or more established sort of mainline spiritual lineages. There's this same sense that the lineage is meant to stay alive and grow and change if it's really alive with each generation, but there needs to be an honoring of the training and the ancestors and the background that's founded upon. And then even in a radical innovation like hip hop culture, that's could be considered very new. It's like, even then, look at KRS-One and like the teachings of original hip hop culture. You're like, you don't, as he says, like, you shout the ancestors. You don't start, sharing your own original creative work without giving credit to your predecessors and the influences and giving shout outs and so on. So it's a very, universal quality, I think, of respect. And I think in general, we can work on that. Like, a lot of my research is on alchemy. And it's really funny. You look at like the Silk Road, you look at the history of alchemy, and there's a lot of researchers that still to this day, even really open-minded radical ones, they're like, oh, gunpowder, it came out of alchemy, and this Western, alchemist invented gunpowder, but it existed a long time before that within alchemy, but in China, and that's where it came from.
And then there's the whole beauty dimension of like, look at all the threads of connection and transmission across the human race. And it's an opportunity for us to acknowledge each other. It's an opportunity to shout out one another. It's an opportunity to build these threads of connections. It's an opportunity to honor one another. And it's a way that we, man, this is even, okay, like, I'm just going to take a 10,000 foot view on the struggle that's happening in the world right now. From my point of view, the struggle is we are transitioning from a period of Western world domination and of the general archetype of empire to a planetary civilization that can contain and absorb and work with the contributions of multiple cultures and societies. And as we are making that transition, and this is Pluto energy, Pluto is the tectonic force of evolution. You don't like it, it's Octavia Butler's God is change. You don't like it, stuff is changing. Climate change, who wants this? It's gonna force us to. Okay? We're in each other's faces now. We can still beat our chest about who's superior, whose civilization is superior. We can still try to gun each other down and blah, blah, blah. But I think we're being forced into interconnection. We're being forced into interdependence. We're being forced into interrecognition with one another, and And we're being forced to recognize that our collective tool making structures are knitted with the ecology of the planet. And they can be knitted unconsciously, and we can emit gases and elements into the atmosphere that mess with the weather system, or they can be emitted consciously, and we can do what some of the South American indigenous peoples did and plant rainforests that help the whole planet breathe over 5 to 12 generations. You know, we're in this period where we are trying to create autonomous machine intelligences. I mean, we're basically landing aliens on Earth right now, or we're digging up really ancient forces and giving them new bodies. And so in that period, the old thing doesn't want to let go, and it wants to use the new things for an old spirit. And I almost wonder sometimes, and I don't know if this stuff works, and civilizations and collective stuff, see, astrologically, an individual is unpredictable based on their chart. Some astrologers can actually line up some stuff pretty well, but an individual is statistically unpredictable formation. But statistically, groups are predictable. And now the question we have is, can we become conscious as a group? And I think one of the things, as we're being pulled into this new way of living on Earth, the old is trying to hold on to it. It's the same way that you acknowledge something when it's gone. I think in a way we almost need to turn around and say, all right, Western civilization, thank you. Here's where you messed up. This is where you did a good job. This is where there are certain things that we're taking from this worldwide or semi-worldwide conquest, and even from the archetype of empire itself. This is what we learned from you, Empire. Thank you. As we lay you to rest, Empire, we want to thank you for this. Here your kids are saying, hey, Empire, you abused me like this, though. That hurt, man. And maybe the pride of some of these people who are embodying empire might be willing to be like, you know what? You're right. You know, I mean, being a father, man, I'll tell you, I didn't believe this stuff. I was like a feminist guy. And the more I got into being a father, the more I was like, yo, I can feel the energy of the patriarch. I'm right. You know what I'm saying? I felt that because when we play the archetypes, they play us. And so if we're leaving a patriarchal moment, if we're leaving a moment where light skin is considered closer to holiness, and we're entering into a rainbow way of doing human melanin expressions and a rainbow way of doing gender, I think it's also time to turn to these things and say, hey, the whole collective ceremonies, death ceremonies, the hospice modernities, empires, Western worlds, patriarchies, white supremacies, hospice them. But when you hospice somebody, you don't just shoot them dead. You tell them thank you. And you help send them on, you know?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
I don't know where that came from, and I don't know if that was a response to any question.
Well, you're perfectly leading the conversation in all the exact directions I haven't planned to go anyways. So I think this is a great place to start to wrap up. But those were exactly the topics I wanted to touch upon next anyways. So I'm glad you did. And personal recommendation, whether for you or a listener, I don't know if you've heard of it, our African Unconscious.
Yeah.
You heard of it? Dr.
Bynum.
Bynum. Yeah. I was thinking about inviting him to be my dissertation external reader because he's based in Massachusetts. So I've been thinking about reaching out to him. I liked the book. I thought it was very fascinating. So figured I'd mention it. Any last words for this particular episode on the topics you were already discussing there a moment ago, just in terms of what the future looks like, how it relates to, and I think you already answered all these questions. So, you know, if you want to add anything just to bring us to a close, feel free, but how it relates to the work you're doing in the world, anything you want to shout out. I will mention people, if this episode is released before the equinox magically, then do come through to the Interworld Equinox Festival and hear Ramon speak in person and experience some of this in an embodied way there, or whatever next events we're doing together. So I'll mention that, and any work you're doing with the regenerative movement, views of the future. You mentioned we're literally landing ancient aliens on the planet with artificial intelligence, all these things. It brought up the old Kabbalistic tales of the golem.
Yes.
Yeah, right, made out of mud. And the magician's supposed to be able to write the name of the golem on the forehead into the clay to be able to control the golem, this giant creature. So they write the magic Hebrew name on their forehead into the clay, but sometimes the golem's too tall and they can't reach the forehead. They can't engrave the name. Then it goes out of control. And to
Yeah.
me, that's a great metaphor for if our technology and our external power of technology exceeds our internal maturing of empathy, of awareness, of psyche, we get that golem effect. And so I think we're we're at this precipice where our external powers are being so amplified, it's crucial that we're catching ourselves up from the inside to those powers so that we can use them properly and responsibly. So those are
Yes,
some of my
sir.
perspectives on the future. And if you want to add any last words here to close us out.
Yeah. Yes, totally, man. Okay. One thing I want to say astrologically, this is another really important movement on the outer planet collective level. Pluto has now moved from Capricorn into Aquarius. And as Pluto moves into Aquarius, some astrologers will disagree with this interpretation. There's discussion and debate about it. But I believe that anytime there's an outer planet in a sign and we're also transiting into a world age, the outer planet is energizing that world age. And we are in this transition point, and it's a multi-century transition point between the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius. And I believe that one of the things that Pluto will be in Aquarius from now until about 2044. And I believe that at this time we are setting up Pluto's these tectonic changes. We are setting up, I believe, the foundation on a material level and on a agreement structure level and on a level of karmic and ecological consequences. We are setting up the foundation of the age of Aquarius in this next 20 years. And between now and 2050, I really feel like we have to recognize the situation that we're in, and we have to make new collective agreements. I'm getting that language from Orland Bishop. Collective agreements about how we are going to live and relate on this earth. And I believe a lot of those agreements are economic and infrastructural. Okay. So between now and 2050. Now, there's a project that I'm working on now, my wife and I are working on, that we launched on the conjunction of Uranus and Jupiter in 2024. And we're calling that 5 to 500. And 5 to 500 is we now need to be the Haudenosaunee. I might be messing the name up there.
Haudenosaunee.
Haudenosaunee, thank you, gave us this beautiful thinking around the 7 generations back and forward. I think we got to go beyond that. We got to be looking 500 years into the future. We need a 500-year horizon. And so what 5 to 500 is we are taking this 500-year horizon and we are trying to apply it to community level climate justice planning. And communities around the country and in different parts of the world are doing this. They are constructing people's plans for climate change or for a just transition. How are you going to deal with food and water and shelter in your community? Suburban, urban, rural. How are you going to deal with energy? How are you going to deal with the new jobs and economies that we're going to need to create as we restructure our infrastructure? And can we restructure our infrastructure so that they include everyone? So that we don't create another hierarchy and another caste system around our infrastructures, you know? And so that's the justice piece. And then the climate piece is, like, how do we develop regenerative systems, permaculture, food justice, relocalizing some of our food production. You're not going to get all of it, chances are, but some of it. Take the weight off the whole system. Generate what you can locally. Be ready. Have a resilient community. Look at these disasters. The Los Angeles fires. You know what I mean? The hurricanes, like the floods. Like, look at it. It's happening. Communities got to get prepared. And so we're this community level planning is planning on a local level. And then we're using 500 years as an imaginative time horizon. What does it look like in 500 years? Then we walk back to 250 years, then 100, then 50, then 25. And by the time we're in 25, we're in a range where we have a direct effect on the reality of the future. What's the life of an average building? How long does it take to regrow a patch of forest? 25, 50, 75-ish years. Okay, so we're doing that in Boulder County. We call it 5 to 500, People's Climate Justice Plan. And I'm saying this, I think this is a meme. I hope it goes out everywhere. People, start doing your own local climate justice and community level planning and resilience building. Reach out to your neighbors, reach out to the members of your community that are least likely to be at the city council meeting. Practice democracy locally and hold in your mind the big picture of people all over the planet and people for the next 500 years, as well as people from the past 500 years. Because that's a big part of what this struggle is about too. We're still trying to heal from these last 500 years. We're still trying to heal from the dismissal of our rites of passage processes, the loss and destruction of languages. And we have these new or very ancient, and so ancient they may as well be new things arising on the earth. And we're going to need to be big, cosmic, but grounded thinkers and feelers and doers to work with these energies and put them into the service of life, to discipline them to the norms of the ecology of the earth and biology. So I'm saying a lot of highfalutin cosmic stuff, but it's real. It's the world we live in. As they said, Earth amplifies the world that you really live. And we are Saturday, we're sitting with communities and we're having different folks present on Earth ships and what parts of or biotecture, what parts of that technology can be adapted into the building of our homes, passive solar, water catchment, presenting on community-built food systems, presenting on community-based wealth, presenting on economies that grow out from the farm. And then the city of Boulder is redoing its comprehensive plan, which is a 20-year plan. And we're actually partnering with the city of Boulder, and we're trying to bring in some of these fresh and edge ideas and say, hey, how do we build this in the zoning? A little of it, a crack for it. So
I will say, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but the last thing you said really got me going, because as the founder here of the Interworld Eco Village, we're on 40 acres near the springs. And I love that you mentioned Boulder County zoning, because we tried to start our land-based community center in Boulder County first, but we couldn't even permit a yurt. So, Nathaniel and I were like, "Can we call it a gur? Let's call it a gur." That's what the Mongolians called it.
I think one of the things we really have to focus on, Uranus is in Taurus. Before Uranus leaves Taurus, Uranus, revolutionary change, Taurus, Earth, how we work with Earth. We got to focus on zoning, people. We got to change and make cracks in the zoning law so that these new structures, these old structures that we know are regenerative, we got to make cracks in the zoning laws so that we can start to build them and show people in urban and suburban areas they work, they can work.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I think we could do another 2 hours just on the most recent chair. To be honest, I feel like we could expand just on the things you've said in the last few minutes for another couple hours. So maybe we'll do that next time. But it's really good having you on. I know you're a busy man, so I'll let you go here in a sec, but I'll see you tomorrow at the 5 to 500 gathering. Be there representing as well. So I'm excited to see you there, and it's good to reconnect. I'm glad you mentioned the Haudenosaunee and democracy in the same few sentences there, because some people might not realize some of the deep and hidden history of, the Iroquois Confederacy, the origins of our whole Constitution, and democracy has much more influence from those First Nations than we realize, very direct. So deep stuff. It's always good seeing you, learning from you, and looking forward to our collaboration in a couple weeks as well. So thanks for all the work you do, and thanks for coming on the podcast. It's really a great pleasure and a great honor.
Yeah, thank you. It was fun. Thanks for having me.